Picture this: 8 years of your life poured into a single company, a system you built from nothing that now generates over $100 million a year. And the moment you finally ask for what you've earned, you're told you're simply not leader material. That's exactly where my story begins, on a gray, overcast morning in Seattle. Standing outside a glass conference room on the 28th floor of Arrow's Technologies, holding a 20-page proposal I had spent weeks refining. My name is Maya Brooks, and that folder in my hands wasn't just paperwork. It was my case for becoming creative director, a role I believed I had more than earned. I hadn't merely helped build the AuroraNet AI platform, I had led it, expanded it, and turned it into the backbone of the company's revenue. The room that morning smelled of coffee and fresh printer ink. At the head of the table sat Valerie Crane, my direct manager, dressed in a sharply pressed black blazer, her expression as unreadable as stone. Beside her sat Jonathan Hale, the company's CEO, a man whose silver watch seemed to match the careful, expensive way he chose his words. I laid out everything on the table. Algorithmic efficiency that had doubled diagnostic accuracy up by 40%. And major clients renewing and expanding their contracts every quarter. I told them plainly that I was ready to lead AuroraNet into its next chapter. Jonathan gave a slow, expressionless nod. Valerie flipped through the pages, the sound of paper cutting through the silence like a countdown. She didn't look up until she'd closed the folder and set it back down with a small, knowing smile. The kind of smile that only appears once a decision has already been made behind closed doors. "Maya," she said, her voice level, "I appreciate your dedication. But leadership isn't only about technical skill. You're a brilliant engineer, but you don't quite carry the presence of a leader yet." I held her gaze and asked what kind of presence she meant. She shrugged it off, something about seeing the bigger picture, navigating office politics, setting direction, the implication being that I was excellent with details but not built for stepping back. Jonathan chimed in, polite but distant, suggesting maybe another year or two. And for now, I should simply keep supporting the research division. I said nothing in response. Instead, my mind raced through every late night I'd spent in the lab until 3 in the morning. Every visit home I'd canceled just to hit a testing deadline. Every report Valerie had signed her name to that I had written word for word. All of it suddenly felt hollow. I smiled anyway, my voice steady as still air, and thanked them both for their time. Valerie tilted her head, satisfied that I seemed to be taking it well. "Patience," she said, "is the virtue of the intelligent." I stood, nodded, and walked out. The glass door slid shut behind me with a soft click that felt less like an exit and more like an ending. Walking down the corridor, I stared out over the Seattle skyline, faint and gray through the window. I thought about every line of code I had written, every system built on sleepless nights. I had once believed good work would speak for itself. But in that world, I was learning. People only see what they've already decided to see. Back at my desk, the AuroraNet processor blinked quietly, unaware it was about to lose the person who had kept it alive. I opened my laptop and stared at the folders lined up in front of me, every project, every note, every idea I had patented before I ever signed a contract with Arrow's. 30 patents still under my own name. I had never planned to use them as leverage. But hearing Valerie say I wasn't leadership material left something cold inside me. And underneath that cold, a small fire began to build. I wrote a single line in my notebook. If they can't see your worth, they'll learn it the hard way. Then I closed it, deleted the next day's meeting invite from my calendar, and switched off my work phone. Outside, rain began tapping against the glass, drawing long streaks down the window. In that quiet rhythm, I realized I wasn't sad anymore, just certain. I was leaving, and when I did, they would finally understand who had been keeping their machine running all along. I sat there under the office lights, listening to the low hum of the computer, and the rain outside. What filled me wasn't acceptance, it was preparation. The next morning I arrived at 8:30 sharp, not a minute early. I skipped my usual stop at the lab, skipped checking the systems before clocking in. Walking across the floor, a few coworkers glanced up and offered thin smiles. News of my rejected promotion had clearly traveled faster than any company memo. In their eyes, I saw sympathy, but also curiosity, as if they were waiting to see how the engineer everyone thought was irreplaceable would react. I sat down, powered up my computer, and pulled up my task list. It looked longer than usual. I marked off only the items tied directly to my own role, and quietly ignored the extra work I used to absorb for other teams. Valerie had told me to focus on my technical responsibilities. So that's exactly what I intended to do. Nothing more, nothing less. By mid-morning, Peter from infrastructure came over, visibly tense. There was a failure in yesterday's Aurora Net patch, he explained. The system was stuck at the pre-processing stage and no one could find the cause. I glanced at the monitoring dashboard, watched the red error blinking across the screen. A month earlier, I would have jumped straight into the code and pushed a fix within the hour. Instead, I simply told him to contact the testing team, since that fell under their responsibility now. He stared at me, confused, then nodded and walked away, leaving nothing behind but the low hum of keyboards. At lunch, I sat alone in the cafe downstairs, the smell of roasted coffee and warm pastries settling over me like calm. On the table sat my old black leather notebook, the one holding every research idea and algorithm prototype I'd developed before ever joining Errol's. I flipped through it slowly, reading old notes stamped with my initials, dates, and official patent submission codes. All valid, all most importantly mine. That afternoon, I began quietly backing up my entire personal archive, every model, every test document, every design connected to those 30 patents, onto a private drive. No one at the company even knew these existed as separate assets, because I had always followed protocol to the letter. I wasn't taking anything that belonged to Errol's. I was only reclaiming what had always been mine. Around 3 o'clock, Valerie appeared at my office door, her tone clipped, asking me to step into her office. I followed her in. The air felt heavier than usual. Standing by the window with her arms folded, she said she'd heard I hadn't helped with the morning's patch debugging, and hoped it wasn't a sign I was losing focus. I answered calmly that I was simply doing my assigned work. Exactly as she had advised, the rest belonged to the testing team. She studied me for a moment, a faint smirk forming. I appreciate diligence, she said, but we both know this company runs on people who go beyond what's required. You understand what I mean, don't you? I told her I understood the difference between commitment and being taken advantage of, and that today I was choosing where that line sat. Her eyes darkened. She turned back to the window, warning me not to let emotion cloud my judgment, insisting Errol's needed me. Maybe so, I said, but clearly they don't need me in a leadership role. I'm only doing what's expected of me. I left her standing there. The door clicked shut behind me, and the hallway felt noticeably colder than before. Later that afternoon, I opened my calendar and began clearing it out, deleting every meeting reminder that wasn't strictly necessary. I also canceled my end-of-month vacation, the first real trip I'd planned in 3 years. Instead of leaving the city to rest, I decided to stay and watch. I wanted to see what would happen to the machine once my steady hand was no longer quietly keeping it balanced. On my screen, the words "backup complete" appeared. I pulled the drive free, locked it away in my desk drawer, and sat back as the office slowly emptied out around me. Fluorescent light cast a pale glow across my desk, while outside, the city lights blinked on one by one, their reflections sliding across the glass like a web of living circuits. Somewhere out there, in towers just like this one, There were people exactly like me working themselves into exhaustion, convinced that effort alone would eventually be rewarded. But I understood now that I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. From the moment Valerie told me I wasn't worthy, I stopped trying to prove anything to anyone. From here on, I would let silence do the talking. When I finally shut down my computer, the low hum of the processor faded, and the room settled into total stillness. I stood, put on my coat, and stepped into the hallway. Everything appeared perfectly normal on the surface, but I knew the foundation underneath was already trembling. No one could see it yet, but the storm had already begun. I walked slowly toward the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. The soft chime that followed echoed down the corridor, closing one long day and quietly marking the start of the collapse to come. 2 days later, Errol's truly began to shake. I didn't notice it through alarms or announcements. I noticed it in the strange silence that had settled over the engineering floor. People moved quickly but said almost nothing. The air was filled instead with the rapid clatter of typing, interrupted only by sighs and the occasional scrape of a chair. When I walked into the lab, Peter was standing in front of the main data board, tension written across his face. I asked what was going on, though I already had a fairly good idea. AuroraNet, he told me, had stopped responding in the clinical prediction module. Patient data was drifting, and every outgoing report was wrong. I looked up at the massive screen, watching graphs flicker erratically like a failing heartbeat. It had been happening since the night before, he said. Valerie wanted his team to fix it immediately, but no one could locate the source of the problem. She'd told him I understood the algorithm's core better than anyone else, and that they needed me to take a look. I paused for a moment, then said quietly that this fell under testing and operations now, and that I was no longer authorized to handle incidents. Valerie was in charge of that. Peter froze. If I didn't step in, he warned, they were going to lose the St. Louis hospital contract, and Valerie was already losing her composure. I turned back to my desk and opened my notebook. I don't want to overstep. I told him calmly, Valerie's right, I'm not leadership material, I'm just an engineer. You should ask your boss. He stared at me for a long moment before finally walking away. The door closed behind him, and the silence that followed felt strange, part satisfaction, part sorrow. By noon, the system reported a full critical failure. Massive amounts of client data froze in place, and faulty diagnostic outputs forced 3 hospitals to suspend their partnership with the company. The news spread fast. Valerie called me into a meeting room with the technical team, and the small space felt thick with tension the moment I stepped inside. She paced near the front, holding a stack of error logs marked up in red, and looked straight at me as I entered. Maya, do you know why AuroraNet crashed? I pulled out a chair and told her no, ma'am. You built the algorithm's core, she snapped. Don't pretend you don't understand. We need you to fix it right now. I told her, evenly, that this was the testing department's responsibility now, and that I no longer handled error resolution. My role was limited to supporting module development. Valerie slammed her palm against the table. Don't start quoting contracts at me, Maya. You know this system better than anyone. If you don't fix it, the entire project collapses. I met her eyes and told her that if it did collapse, maybe that would finally show the company the value of the people it had spent years underestimating. The room went completely silent. I stood, gathered my folder, and added that if they needed formal assistance, I would wait for a written request from the executive board before following any protocol. Then I walked out, leaving Valerie standing frozen amid a pile of failure reports. By afternoon, the breakdown had spread even further. The problem wasn't isolated to the algorithm anymore. The entire system had lost synchronization across every server. Major clients kept calling in, and I could hear Valerie shouting into the phone from the office next door. her voice rising above the noise of keyboards and shuffling paper. By the end of the day, Jonathan sent out an email summoning every department head to an emergency meeting the following morning. The subject line contained only 3 words: Aurora Net Crisis Meeting. I read it once, then shut down my computer. Outside, the rain had picked up again. I grabbed my coat and stood by the window for a moment, watching the downpour blur the city lights into tangled reflections, like circuits shorting out one by one. I realized I didn't feel anxious at all. For 8 years, I had been the one who quietly fixed what others broke. Now, for the first time, I wanted to see what happened when I simply let it break. As I crossed the lobby, Valerie was on the phone, her voice sharp with panic, telling someone that if this wasn't fixed, they were finished. I walked past her without looking back. Driving home, I turned on the radio, letting a slow jazz tune fill the car between the soft rhythm of rain against the windshield. What I felt wasn't joy or triumph. It was something closer to freedom. Freedom from carrying the weight of people who had never truly deserved it. That night, my phone lit up with more than 10 calls, all from internal company numbers. I let it sit silent, screen down on the desk, while Seattle continued to drown in rain outside. In the dim light of my apartment, a folder sat on the desk labeled Patents 30 Final, its title glowing faintly in the reflection of my monitor, a quiet reminder that the real game had only just begun. The next morning, the Seattle sky was still damp and heavy. I arrived at the office later than usual at 8:40, and the air inside felt thick, almost foggy with tension. People moved quickly through the hallways, their faces drawn tight. Small clusters of engineers stood gathered around the error display boards, and when I passed by, they gave slight nods while carefully avoiding eye contact. The moment I set my bag down, Valerie called, her voice cut through the phone like a blade. Conference room, 17th floor, now. The room itself was bright, its tall windows framing the gray city beyond. Valerie stood beside the large display screen, while Jonathan sat at the head of the table, surrounded by colleagues I had worked alongside for years. On the screen, red error charts blinked their warning in silence. Jonathan opened the meeting by stating plainly that Aurora Net was facing a major failure, that 3 key clients had already suspended their contracts, and that Valerie believed the problem had started with my team. He wanted to hear my explanation. Valerie turned toward me, her eyes cold, her tone accusatory, reminding everyone that I was the only person who fully understood Aurora Net's core, that I had stopped my support procedures, and that the system had collapsed as a result. What, she asked, did I have to say about that? I looked around the room. The white light bounced off the glass table, and every familiar face wore the same expression, waiting to see how I would defend myself. I took a breath and opened my laptop, the blue glow lighting my face as I spoke. I told them plainly that I hadn't stopped a single process that fell within my own responsibility. But perhaps, I added, I had finally allowed everyone else to notice what I'd been quietly carrying for them all along. Valerie's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. I clicked open a folder labeled Patents 30 Final. The screen filled with a long list of PDF files, each one a registered patent record. I turned the laptop toward the table. "These 30 patents," I said slowly, "are the foundation of Aurora Net. Every deep learning model, every self-optimizing algorithm, every data synchronization framework, all of it originated from these documents, and all of them were registered before I ever signed a contract with Errol's." The room went completely silent. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Valerie stood frozen, her mouth slightly parted, but no words came out. I opened one of the files, and a patent certificate filled the screen, my name printed clearly under author, alongside its official registration date. I shared these ideas when the company needed them. I continued, "But now that I've been told I lack leadership potential, I think it's time we reconsider how this company defines value. Valerie shot up from her chair, her voice rising sharply. You can't claim those as your own. You developed them while working for Errol's. They belong to the company. I held her gaze steadily. No, Valerie. I developed the initial models during my doctoral research, and I filed those patents before Errol's even formed its research division. The company was granted usage rights, not ownership. I sent copies of these records to the legal department 3 years ago. They verified everything. Jonathan leaned forward, elbows on the table, quiet for several long seconds before finally asking if I was saying Errol's didn't actually own the Aurora Net platform. I'm saying, I answered, that the company has been using my technology under an informal verbal agreement, without any written transfer of ownership. If necessary, I can provide full documentation to prove it. Valerie snapped that I was threatening them. I shook my head. No, I just want the truth acknowledged. I've worked with complete dedication, asking for nothing but fairness. But if fairness has no place here, then I have no reason to keep protecting something that isn't respected. The room stayed frozen. Jonathan stared down at the list of patents for a long moment before finally speaking, his tone quiet but firm. Legal would verify everything immediately, and the meeting was adjourned. Valerie glared at me, her voice low and sharp, warning me that I was burning bridges I'd never be able to rebuild. I closed my laptop and gathered my papers. That bridge was never mine. I told her. I just lent it to them to cross. Then I walked out, leaving a wave of murmurs behind me. The hallway stretched out ahead, but for the first time in months I felt light. I knew that after this meeting, nothing at Errol's would ever be the same again. Back in my office, my inbox filled quickly with messages from coworkers, some curious, some anxious, most saying nothing meaningful at all. I shut the computer down and looked out the window as the rain fell harder, the city glowing like a wet circuit board flickering under gray light. I understood in that moment that the balance of power inside Errol's had shifted completely, and for the first time in years, I was the one holding the strongest card. 3 days after that meeting, the atmosphere inside Errol's felt heavier than ever, as though the entire building were holding its breath before a storm. I knew the legal department had quietly begun reviewing my patents. Every time I walked down the hallway, conversations would stop mid-sentence, eyes would dart away, and whispers would die out almost instantly. None of it surprised me in that building. News always traveled faster than the internal network ever could. Monday morning, while I was pouring coffee in the pantry, Jonathan's assistant appeared, her expression unreadable, and told me Mr. Hale wanted to see me in the conference room on the 22nd floor immediately. I had known this moment was coming, I just hadn't expected it quite so soon. This time, the room held a very different group. Only Jonathan, Valerie, and 2 members of the legal team were present, along with a gray-haired man flipping methodically through a thick folder. When I walked in, Jonathan gestured to the seat across from him. "Have a seat, Maya." I set down my coffee and sat up straight. His tone was calm, but his eyes looked tired. "I've reviewed all the patent records you presented last week. Legal has confirmed your claim. The patents were indeed filed before your official employment with Errol's. The company holds usage rights but not ownership." Valerie cut in immediately, accusing me of exploiting a loophole to threaten the company, insisting I knew exactly how dependent they were on the platform. I didn't even look at her. "I'm not threatening anyone, Valerie. I'm simply showing everyone a truth that's been ignored for years." She slammed her palm on the table, her voice tight with anger, demanding to know if I understood how much the company had invested in these projects, as if a few pieces of paper made me the sole owner of everything they'd built together. I took a slow breath and answered steadily. "Those pieces of paper are the foundation of the entire system you're running. I don't deny the company's investment, but the intellect, the core that keeps it alive, is mine. And if the company won't respect that, I won't keep contributing The gray-haired lawyer finally spoke, his tone measured and precise. If Errol's continued using this technology without a revised agreement, he explained, the company would be violating my intellectual property rights, which could lead to serious litigation. Valerie turned to Jonathan, her voice cracking with frustration, insisting they couldn't let this happen, that if I walked away, the entire Aurora Net project would collapse. Jonathan leaned back, fingers interlaced, his eyes fixed on me. Maya, I understand you're angry. You have every right to feel hurt, but we can find a solution. I want you to stay. I'm prepared to offer you a new position, Chief Technology Officer, with a substantial salary increase. I looked at him steadily. I appreciate the offer, but I've already made another choice. Another company reached out. They've offered me a similar role with full ownership of my patents. Valerie nearly sprang from her chair, accusing me of using Errol's as leverage to bargain with a competitor. I turned to her, my expression unchanged. No, Valerie, I'm doing exactly what people like you always taught me, negotiate based on your own worth. Silence settled over the room. Jonathan clasped his hands, staring down at the table, and quietly asked who they were. I told him I didn't feel obligated to say. All he needed to know was that they were willing to give me the position I'd been told I didn't deserve here. He looked up, concern flickering across his face, and asked if I was really leaving. I already filed my resignation. I said, I'm just here to finalize the process. I don't want to leave with hostility, but if I have to, I'll defend my rights. Valerie let out a short, bitter laugh, asking if I really believed walking away with a few documents made me powerful. I met her eyes. I don't think, I know. The words left her speechless. Jonathan raised a hand, cutting her off, his tone softening into something almost pleading as he told me I was a vital part of the company. That if I left, they'd lose a great deal that here, at least I had a team, infrastructure, resources, and starting over elsewhere wouldn't be easy. I answered quietly that I'd started over many times in my life, but that this time, at least, it would be on my own terms. Jonathan exhaled, his voice weary, and finally agreed, asking only that I not cause the company any further harm, and that they would handle the rest. I nodded, telling him I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was simply withdrawing from what no longer belonged to me. Valerie muttered something sarcastic about calling that noble. I call it fair, I said. Jonathan closed the meeting, instructing me to hand over my work within 2 weeks, and asking Valerie to coordinate with legal on reviewing all Aurora Net agreements. I stood, gathered my folder, and told Valerie quietly that 2 weeks might feel longer than she expected. As I left the room, I heard a chair scrape and a sharp exhale behind me. I didn't turn around. I already knew she was staring, burning with fury. The hallway on the 22nd floor stretched out long and silent ahead of me. I walked slowly, feeling as though a weight had finally lifted off my shoulders. But underneath that relief was something else entirely, not peace, but readiness. I knew Valerie wouldn't let this end quietly. That afternoon, a message arrived from an unknown number. We're very impressed by what you've done. Let's talk soon. Thomas Reed, CEO, Neurosyn Labs. I read it and smiled faintly. I didn't need to guess how they'd found out. News of my departure had clearly already reached the competition. In this world, I was learning. Opportunity often shows up right after people assume you've lost everything. When I left the office that evening, Seattle was raining again. I walked slowly beneath the glass canopy, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain, the scent of wet earth mixing with the evening chill. Behind me, the Errol's building glowed like some enormous creature trying to swallow the last light of dusk. I stopped and looked up at the company logo on the tower. For 8 years, I had given most of my youth to those walls. Now I was finally walking away, not to escape, but to prove that true worth isn't something others grant you permission to have. It's something you claim for yourself the moment you decide to. I pulled my coat tighter and stepped into the rain. Inside me, the storm had passed, leaving only calm. But I knew that for Valerie, it was only just beginning. I hadn't even replied to Thomas Reed's message when, the next morning, my personal inbox showed an official invitation, just 3 short lines, direct and stripped of any flattery. Dr. Brooks, we know you have left Errol's. I would like to meet you not for an interview, but to talk about the future. Thomas Reed, Chief Executive Officer, Neurosyn Labs. I read it several times. The way he wrote intrigued me, no flattery, no corporate politeness, just a straightforward proposal. I decided to meet him. 3 days later, I took the earliest flight to San Francisco, where Neurosyn's headquarters stood. The city greeted me with a foggy morning, the air carrying the scent of salt and cold metal. Their building rose in the financial district, tall but unpretentious, its black glass reflecting the gray sky. The company's logo was carved into granite, small but deliberate, the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to show off. When I passed through security, a young receptionist smiled and told me Mr. Reed was waiting on the 16th floor in the private conference room. His office faced the bay, walls of glass drawing in pale light that shimmered across a polished wooden table. Thomas Reed stood by the window, tall, his hair streaked with silver, his posture calm and deliberate. When he turned, his gaze was steady, the look of a man used to high-stakes negotiations. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice deep, both cordial and cautious. "I've reviewed your patent files. Impressive." I smiled and told him I hadn't realized those files were public. He shrugged, "Not public, but word travels fast in this world, especially when it makes Errol's tremble. You do know they've lost nearly 30% of their stock value this week?" I said nothing. The news didn't make me happy or sad. It only confirmed what I'd always known. They never truly understood what they were holding. Thomas pulled out a chair for me, then sat across from me. You can probably guess why I asked to meet. I told him I'd assume it was to discuss collaboration. He nodded. "Not just collaboration. I want you to lead our medical artificial intelligence research division, Vice President of Technological Innovation, double your previous salary, complete creative autonomy." I looked at him directly and asked about the patents. Thomas smiled, his eyes sharp. "They stay yours. I don't want them. I want the person who understands them." There was no flattery in his tone, only calculation, the smart kind. He knew exactly what I was worth and was willing to invest in it. In the tech world, few people could say that and truly mean it. I asked him why he trusted me, pointing out that I had just pushed my old company into crisis. He smiled faintly. "I don't see destruction. I see someone who built a system so well that when she walked away, it collapsed. That's not sabotage. That's proof of brilliance and integrity." We talked for nearly 2 hours, not an interview, but a genuine conversation. 2 people dissecting the same problem from different angles. Thomas asked about my vision for artificial intelligence in medicine, about ethics, about the tension between creativity and corporate politics. I answered honestly, sometimes sharply. He only nodded, never arguing. When we finally stood, he extended his hand. "I think we'll work well together. Welcome to Neurosyn if you say yes." I shook his hand firmly. "I'll give you my answer in 2 days." He smiled. "I know you'll come back." That afternoon, I sat in a cafe by the harbor, watching the light shimmer across the dull gray water. On my tablet was the draft contract Thomas had emailed. Every clause was clear and transparent, and one line at the bottom caught my eye. Patent owner, Dr. Maya Brooks. Full ownership, no transfer required. I thought of Valerie, of how she had once told me I didn't have leadership qualities, that I was just the one working behind the scenes. Now I was being invited to lead a division she would never believe I could run. I flew back to Seattle that night. The city was still drenched in rain, and the office felt unusually quiet. Valerie wasn't there, though word was she was meeting privately with legal. As I walked through the hallway, a few people greeted me softly. Cautiously, I could tell the news of my resignation was now official. The next day at noon, Valerie appeared at my door, wearing a dark blazer, her face stiff as stone. "Got a minute, Maya?" I stood and gestured for her to come in. She looked around the office, her eyes settling on the folder on my desk. "So you're really leaving?" "I'm not leaving," I said. "I'm moving somewhere that recognizes value when it sees it." She took a slow breath and sat down, her voice lower than usual. "You know they won't let you walk away. Jonathan has been talking to the lawyers. They'll try to keep you here, or at least keep those patents." I told her I wasn't surprised, but everything I'd done was legal. I'd checked twice. Valerie studied me for a moment, her tone softening into something darker. "You don't understand, Maya. They won't let you in. What you're doing is dangerous." I tilted my head slightly and asked, "Dangerous for whom?" She didn't answer. After a pause, she stood and turned toward the door. "You're smart, but naive, if you think you can walk out of Errol's without paying a price." I watched her leave, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air long after the door shut. I knew Valerie wasn't bluffing. She was too clever, too ruthless to issue empty threats. That night I called Thomas. "I'm in," I said simply. "Welcome aboard," he replied. "The final contract will arrive in the morning. We'll set up everything, the lab, the research team. You just need to show up and begin." After the call, I stood by the window, watching the city shimmer under a thin layer of rain, street lights, casting gold reflections across the wet asphalt. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be calm. Valerie would strike back, but for once I wasn't alone. I pulled a small note from my desk, wrote one line, and stuck it to the wall. "The day I leave Errol's, the first day of freedom." As the street lights dimmed outside, I felt a quiet clarity settle over me. Not because I had won, but because at last I had chosen my own battlefield. I thought that once the contract with Neurosyn Labs was signed, everything would finally settle down. I had completed every formality, handed over all my work, returned my access badge, and even sent a thank you note to the engineering team I once led. I believed I had left quietly without hurting anyone, but Valerie was never someone who let things end peacefully. 3 days after I started my new job in San Francisco, I received the first email from Errol's legal representative. The subject line was short, cold, and deliberate. Notice of contract breach and unauthorized use of intellectual property. I read every line carefully. The tone was threatening, the words calculated. They accused me of taking and using proprietary technology developed during my employment at Errol's for the benefit of a competitor, and demanded that I immediately cease all research activity and return all data related to AuroraNet. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I forwarded the message to my attorney, Rachel Morgan, an old college friend who now specialized in intellectual property law. Half an hour later, she called. "Congratulations, Maya," she said, her voice a mix of irony and sympathy. "You're officially the target of one of the biggest corporate lawsuits of the year." I told her I supposed Valerie was behind it. "Without a doubt," she said, "but don't worry, I've reviewed all your patent documentation. Every filing predates your employment with Errol's. They have no solid legal ground." I sighed and told her Valerie didn't need legal ground. She just needed noise. Rachel chuckled softly. "Then we'll answer her noise with silence and evidence." She was right. In battles like this, whoever loses composure first loses everything. That night, the headlines exploded online. Errol's Technologies sues former senior employee for theft of trade secrets. My picture appeared on the front page of a major tech outlet. Errol's released a press statement calling me a disgruntled former employee who left with proprietary material. Valerie stood at a press conference, immaculate as ever, her voice calm and practiced. We respect those who once contributed. She said, but we cannot tolerate actions that endanger hundreds of employees and thousands of patients who depend on our technology. I watched the video in the Nurisin conference room during my first team meeting. Thomas walked over and rested a hand on my shoulder. You don't have to worry. Our legal team is ready. Just focus on your work. I nodded, though my mind was a storm. 3 weeks later, the first hearing took place in federal court in San Francisco. I sat beside Rachel, watching the crowd of reporters filling the corridor outside. Errol's had brought 4 lawyers, and Valerie was there too. Her first appearance outside company walls. Her face looked harder than ever, but her eyes still carried the same mix of disdain and weariness. When the judge asked both sides to speak, Errol's lead attorney began sharply. Your Honor, my client has suffered significant damages due to Dr. Maya Brooks's serious breach of contract. She transferred the proprietary Aurora Net technology, developed over 8 years, to a direct competitor, Nurisin Labs. Rachel rose calmly, holding a thin folder. Your Honor, we have conclusive evidence that all patents related to Aurora Net were filed before Dr. Brooks signed her employment contract with Errol's. Every document has been verified by the National Patent Registry. There is no clause transferring ownership of intellectual property to the company. She opened the folder, displaying the papers on the bench. Here is the original filing certificate, dated March 14, 2014, 4 months before her employment began. And here is video recording of the first prototype test, conducted before Errol's even established its research division. The courtroom murmured. Valerie leaned toward her lawyers, her face drained of color. I stayed still, my eyes locked on her. The judge nodded. Evidence admitted. The hearing will continue after both sides complete document review. Outside, reporters swarmed the steps. One asked if I had anything to say to Errol's or Valerie Crane. I gave them only one line. I did not take anything. I simply kept what was mine. In the weeks that followed, the media turned in my favor. Several outlets began investigating Errol's internal culture, uncovering stories of employees whose contributions had been erased, their names stripped from patents, their credit claimed by superiors. Public opinion shifted. Errol's went from being seen as a technology powerhouse to a symbol of corporate exploitation. Valerie struck back through the press, appearing on a televised interview and speaking with moral indignation. She may win on paper, she said, but what about ethics? She betrayed those who trusted her. I turned off the television. Rachel texted me, do not respond. Let her bury herself with her own words. She was right again. A few days later, a former Errol's engineer posted a detailed account of how Valerie had coerced subordinates into sharing credit on projects she hadn't actually built. The story spread rapidly, and the public began questioning everything Valerie said. Thomas called me into his office and smiled across the desk. Looks like you've become something of a symbol, Maya. The press is calling you the woman who stood up to the system. That's good for Nurisin, you know. I gave a tired smile and told him I never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted peace to work. And you'll have that soon, he said. Errol's is crumbling from within. I hear Valerie has been suspended. Their board is preparing to drop the lawsuit. I looked out the window at the California sunlight spilling over the bay. I didn't feel joy, only emptiness. As if the months of fighting had drained every last bit of energy I had left. That night, Rachel called again, her voice bright. Good news, Errol's officially withdrew the lawsuit. They knew they couldn't win. Valerie has been placed on indefinite leave. You're free, Maya. I paused, letting the words sink in. Free, I repeated. It sounded familiar, yet strangely new. I stepped onto the balcony, watching city lights ripple over the water. In my hand was the printed copy of Thomas's first message. Not for an interview, but to talk about the future. I finally understood what that future meant. But somewhere inside me, one question remained. Why had Valerie hated me so much? Maybe she once believed in the same things I did, that talent alone was enough, until the system crushed that belief out of her. Maybe her hatred wasn't really about me being better, but about me doing what she never could, walking away. I folded the paper and set it in my drawer. Outside, the sea was dark and still. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of salt and wind. The war was over, but my path had only just begun. When everything with Errol's finally ended, I thought I'd need time to recover. Instead, it felt like shedding an invisible chain I'd been carrying for years. Starting over at Neurocen Labs was like breathing new air. No one there asked why I'd left Errol's. No one looked at me with curiosity. Thomas Reid kept his word. He gave me complete freedom to build an entirely new research division. My lab sat on the top floor, walled in glass, overlooking the foggy San Francisco Bay. On the door was a single engraved line that carried more weight than any title I'd ever held. Department of Innovation, Director Maya Brooks. I stood there for a while before stepping inside. This was my space now, and every decision made within it would be mine alone. I began hiring during my first week. I wasn't looking for big names or loud resumes. I was looking for people like I once was, quiet and precise. I brought in a data engineer who'd been labeled unfit for leadership, a coder whose supervisor had stolen her work, and a systems analyst dismissed as too reserved to move up. They had all been overlooked, and that was exactly why I trusted them. They understood the value of being trusted. The new project was called Billionaire, a spiritual successor to AuroraNet, but built on an entirely different vision. I wanted it to be more than a medical data engine. I wanted a system that could learn from its own failures and evolve without waiting for human instruction. Part 6, we started from zero. No one on the team came from Errol's or carried its past with them. The lab filled with sticky notes, screens full of flowing code, and the soft rhythm of keyboards long after midnight. Thomas often stopped by, but he rarely interfered. He would ask the same question each time. Do you need anything else? I always said, just more time. And he would nod and quietly leave the room. After 3 months, Billionaire completed its first successful trial. The results exceeded every expectation. Diagnostic accuracy came in 45% higher than AuroraNet, and processing speed was cut in half. But what made me proudest was its resilience. The system could keep running even if part of its core failed. The same way I had learned to keep standing when no one stood beside me. Thomas asked me to present our findings to the board. The room was packed that day. I walked them through the data, the graphs, the real-time simulations, and closed with a single line that made the room fall silent. Billionaire wasn't just technology, I told them. It was a reminder that every breakthrough has to stand on a foundation of respect for the people who create it. After a brief pause, applause broke out. Thomas shook my hand under the bright lights and told me Billionaire would launch within a month, and that I would be the face of the project. I hesitated, never having liked attention, but he said that was exactly why people would believe me. On launch day, the name Billionaire spread across every major tech publication. One headline read, Neurocen Labs unveils medical AI that surpasses AuroraNet. Commenters everywhere began calling me a symbol of a new creative generation. At the press conference, I kept my remarks brief. I said that sometimes you have to leave the place you built just to be seen clearly, and that technology is only powerful when it's built with respect and integrity. The speech lasted only a few minutes, but by the next day it had gone viral, shared millions of times. Analysts wrote that Billionaire wasn't just a new product. It was a declaration about the future of the industry. One evening, I received an email from Valerie Crane. Her address appeared clearly on the screen, and even without opening it, I knew what it would say. The single sentence inside read, "Are you happy now?" I deleted it without replying. Valerie still didn't understand that happiness doesn't come from victory or power, but from being free to do what you believe is right. Not long after news about Errol's broke, they had lost 3 major contracts, including Ellison, the client I had originally brought in. Their stock fell to its lowest point in 10 years. Jonathan Hale resigned, and Valerie was removed from the board. No one knew where she went. Thomas walked into my lab one day while I was reviewing Lunaire's performance reports. He mentioned that Errol's had once considered buying Neurison just to erase our project from the market, but they no longer had the strength to do it. I told him I never wanted revenge. I only wanted to create something they could never ignore. He nodded, smiling, and said that was the most perfect answer of all. A month later, Lunaire was deployed globally. Hospitals began sending letters of thanks, saying the system had helped them detect critical patients sooner. I printed one letter and pinned it above my desk. That evening, as the sun set over the bay, I sat alone in the lab, watching the light reflect across the glass walls. Everything inside me was calm. I understood, finally, that true victory was never about making others fall. It was about standing up again exactly where they'd hoped you would stay down. Thomas came by with 2 cups of coffee and asked why I was still there so late. I told him I was thinking about the next step. He laughed and said people like me never stop. I looked out at the city lights flickering to life and said softly that I was done running from the past. I was only moving forward. He understood. Only those with the courage to leave, he said, are strong enough to change the world. I smiled, looking at the final lines of Lunaire's code, and realized he was right. I had walked away not to escape, but to begin again in a place where worth is seen and respect is real. 1 year after Lunaire's launch, I returned to Seattle for the Global Medical Technology Conference. The city greeted me with cool air, the scent of rain, and the low hum of wind drifting from the bay. I had once left this place carrying quiet disappointment. Now I came back as someone who had finally found her place. That morning I stood in front of the hotel mirror adjusting my blazer. The badge hanging around my neck read simply, Maya Brooks, Executive Vice President, Neurison Labs. I looked at it for a few seconds and smiled, not for the title, but for what it meant. I had earned it through my own hands and mind. No one had handed it to me. The conference was held in the city's largest convention center. When I walked in, camera flashes burst from every direction. Thomas Red was waiting in the lobby. He shook my hand, smiling. Today, you're the keynote speaker. They want to hear how someone once underestimated could end up reshaping an entire industry. I told him softly that I'd just tell the truth and let everyone else decide the rest for themselves. The auditorium was full. As I stepped onto the stage, the noise faded into silence. Standing under the lights, I looked out at hundreds of faces, scientists, executives, students, and even a few people who had once doubted me. In the front row, I spotted familiar faces from Errol's, now working elsewhere, their expressions carrying both surprise and respect. I began speaking calmly, without notes. A few years ago, I told them, I sat in a meeting room listening to my boss tell me I didn't deserve the position I dreamed of. I stayed silent then, but in my mind I made myself a promise. If no one believed in my worth, I would prove it myself. I told them about leaving Errol's, about the sleepless nights in a small Neurison lab, and about Lunaire, a system that had made hospitals more efficient and saved countless lives. Success, I told them, isn't born from revenge. It comes from knowing what you deserve and having the courage to protect it. When I finished, the hall stayed quiet for a moment before applause broke like a wave. I bowed slightly, but what I felt wasn't pride, only peace. I knew I had closed the old chapter for good. After the speech, a middle-aged woman approached me, wearing a beige suit, her face familiar, though it took a few seconds to place her. It was Elaine Porter, Errol's former chief financial officer. She extended her hand and spoke softly. Maya, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything that happened. You deserve all that you have. I shook her hand gently and told her I held no anger. If it hadn't happened, I wouldn't be who I am now. She smiled, nodded, and walked away. I watched her go, feeling lighter than air. In that moment, I knew the past had finally stayed where it belonged. That evening, Thomas invited me to dinner at a small restaurant by the bay. He raised his glass and told me that in 1 year, Billionaire had expanded to 13 countries, and the board had just voted unanimously to promote me to Senior Vice President of Global Strategy. I froze for a second, then smiled, telling him he didn't have to do that. I was content where I was. His expression stayed calm. I'm not doing it for you, he said. I'm doing it for the company. We need leaders who understand that power doesn't come from control, but from the ability to empower others. I was silent for a moment, then nodded. If that's the case, I'll accept on one condition. Name it, he said. I want to create an internal development program for people like I once was talented but overlooked. They deserve a chance to be seen. Thomas smiled. And that's exactly why I trust you. The next morning, the official announcement went out, and the company filled with congratulations. Colleagues stopped by my office, but the ones who meant the most were the first 3 people I had hired for the Billionaire team. They stood at the door holding a small bouquet and a card that read, "Thank you for seeing us." I took the flowers, my eyes stinging. That night, I stayed late at the office. The lab was quiet, only the sound of the wind from the bay drifting through. On my desk sat the finished proposal for the new program. I slipped it into a folder and wrote the title on the cover, Pathway Program, A Road for the Unseen. I turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of the computer reflecting off the glass. At the window, I looked down at the city glowing beneath me and thought of those long nights at Errol's. The sound of rain tapping against the lab roof. I realized that without that time, I would never have learned how to stand tall in silence. My phone buzzed, a message from Thomas. The board approved it. The Pathway program is official. Congratulations. I set the phone down and smiled. Outside, the city lights shimmered on the water. Maybe I thought this was what I had truly wanted all along, not fame or power, but the chance to build a place where no one would ever be dismissed the way I once was. I stood there for a long time until the city began to dim. Before leaving, I picked up a marker and wrote on the glass wall one final line, "Respect the Creator, or you will lose the future itself." Then I closed the door, listening to the soft echo fade into the still air. I knew the journey had come full circle, not to avenge the past, but to change how the world measures worth. Because sometimes the most powerful way to fight back isn't to shout, but to walk away and let them see exactly what they lost.